Okay, well, welcome everybody to the July 23rd, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Subcommittee on Rural Resilience and Adaptation. Today is I feel like we've reached a milestone, or we will reach a milestone after today. And then of course, we'll probably, tinker and tweak with these pathways and strategies for the next 6 weeks, but we've at least reached the milestone, so it's great. I'm just pulling up our agenda here. Okay, so let's do the business piece of the meeting first. There's the minutes are attached to or linked in the agenda. We are going to go over primarily our main discussion today is going to be around the draft pathways and strategies, which you all should have received in your email, as well as a follow-up edition from ACCD around housing. When we're done with that discussion and we've kind of landed where we have landed on the pathways and strategies that we wish to put in front of the Vermont Climate Council on Monday, we'll talk about next steps for August and September, and then next steps and actions to prepare for Monday's meeting. Are there any additions or questions or anything related to the agenda or minutes? Hearing none, let's jump in. Okay, so I think, why don't we walk
I just noticed Sue just posted a minutes correction in the chat. So without anyone, unless there's objections, we'll correct the attendance to note that Ian was present at the 16th.
Perfect. Okay, Catherine, I'm going to share my screen with the document that you sent out yesterday. Alrighty. Oh, share. There we go. It's on a bit of a different screen here, so let me just get situated. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yep.
Great. I think, why don't we start off by walking through the pathways and strategies. So just as you recall, we asked for folks to outline the strategies that came from your task groups that you wish to prioritize based on the pathway language that was sent to you on Monday. And one, I want to thank everybody for paying close attention to the instructions and doing your darndest to get your input to us. We received, there was a couple of folks that we didn't hear from, but we received input from most folks. And what we did was we took what we thought was probably translating into strategies from some of the input, like, for example, Joe Segali in the critical transportation pieces, the way he outlined his pathways and strategies actually fit well into the framework that is in front of you. I hope everybody's had a chance to take a look at these in detail. We'll start, I think, with the pathway language. Our pathways are really something that we ought to land on really strict agreement in. The strategies on how to achieve those pathways are something that may continue to get tweaked over time, but really the pathways are the big ideas, the main focus of what this subcommittee hopes to accomplish and put into the climate action plan. So number one,
and just before we jump in, just remind folks that we know the task groups spent a lot of time doing a lot of work on actions and more details under most of these strategies, and that's not lost, and we will come back to all of that. We're using this higher level discussion points to really drive the public outreach. And so that together with the work you've already done will help feed the more detailed actions later on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. We definitely, it's very good to have that to draw on, because likely many of those actions may come up when in the public engagement process, and we'll have really concrete language to pull from. Okay, so let's start with pathways, and then we'll delve into strategies. And so the first one is related to local and regional capacity, including community and civic infrastructure for resilience planning and implementation, and address inequities of under-resourced communities. So this is really about the local and regional capacity to be able to engage in resilience planning and project implementation. This is also meant to capture some of the more social construct dynamic that we've been talking about, some of those social support networks, individual preparedness. Marion provided some input to us right before this meeting with some suggested language around that. Haven't had a chance to take a look at it yet, but she did have some suggested strategies that may strengthen the social network and that whole dynamic that may need to be bolstered a little bit in terms of the strategies. I'll go through the pathways, and then we can kind of open it up for discussion around the pathways to see if we're missing something or if we need to clarify something. Number two, proactively and strategically enhance resilience in transportation. Oh, sorry, I gotta, hold on. I edited this based on some feedback. Let me just show my markup here. Proactively and strategically enhance resilience in lifeline critical infrastructure, including transportation, communications, water, wastewater, and energy statewide. We did receive some feedback around this, so I'll talk about that a little bit, and I reworded it. I have a suggested rewording, but you can kind of see that in the track changes there. Number three, so number two is really related to built infrastructure. We felt that there was enough input, and it's very clear in our charge and in the statute that we need to take a really a big focus on built infrastructure. We had talked about lifeline sectors that may be a little bit confusing, especially for lay people that are just reading this and they don't know what lifeline sectors are. And as an emergency management concept, that's totally understandable. But spelling out those four core infrastructure sectors and having a pathway specifically around that, we felt that was important. And we pulled from the folks that handled transportation, electrical infrastructure, communications infrastructure. One area that may need to have a little bit more strengthening in the strategies is water and wastewater, but we can think about that. Number three, support the reduction of municipal, school district, and residential fossil fuel use in rural areas through equitable best practices that address the unique challenges of rural communities. This is around the part of our charge related to providing best practice recommendations to rural communities to reduce GHG emissions. And since that was called out specifically, we felt that it was necessary to have a pathway around that. And the fourth pathway, ensure Vermont's land use policies on current and future land development are adaptive and resilient to climate change impacts by promoting compact development, enhancing the capacity of natural and working lands, and mitigating impacts of climate change with an emphasis on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So this is really the broader land use discussion that we were having, and land use within the governance of a municipality, which is really where our parameters are as a subcommittee. I am highlighting a fifth suggestion for inclusion around housing. Ensure that all people have access to safe, accessible, energy efficient, and affordable housing in location efficient, compact, and mixed use neighborhoods with diverse housing types and equitable access to jobs, services, schools, recreation, and diverse transportation options. So this is really around housing and also municipal design, I would say. There's a bit of overlap here, I think, between land use and this, but I think that's something that we should discuss a little bit further. So I'll pause there. Let's open it up for discussion around the big what pieces that would be presented within to the Climate Council. Chad.
Sure. Yeah, just with respect to this last edition, I think it's a great one. And there's going to be some overlap with, they're talking about this as well in cross-sector mitigation, specifically, smart growth concepts, so as to encourage, greater access to public transportation, shared ride shares, things like that. So I think that's a terrific addition. I'm glad we made it.
On that too, I don't know, maybe everyone does realize this, but when you have that type of development, energy reliability is just better because it's usually in a more urban setting. So just something to think about there too. I don't know if that would actually come into play with any language, but it's a benefit there as well.
Yep.
Is there any areas that, based on our charge, based on what the GWSA says, are there any areas that folks are feeling like we've missed or we just haven't addressed in some way? Ben.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hello, can hear you.
Yep. So yeah, Stephanie and I are just chatting back and forth, and we had sent some suggested strategy planks under the 4 pathways, maybe one draft ago, and I'm trying to sort of see them now, or what became of them. And
Yep.
I guess the specific question is, where does the statewide conservation and buyout program reside now?
Yep. So because some of these strategies, the language was just a bit more broad, I did incorporate those pieces that you folks suggested into some of the other strategies to make them a little bit more broad. Let me find. There was dam resilience, and there was the buyout program. Let me just double check that.
Yeah, those were. I was going to ask about the dam one as well.
I remember reading them, so I know they're in here.
Oh, okay. Stephanie says the buyout program is 4th under number 2.
Yes. Yep. And then, so
Okay.
if you folks feel like we need to call out dam removal specifically with these strategies, I felt like that may be more of an action underneath that 4th bullet. So when we talk about, conservation and buyouts to improve natural river function and reduce repetitive loss, I feel like there's multiple layers of actions that can go under that, and one of them is a dam removal action.
Yeah, I could say including removal of or restoration of natural flows or something.
So improve natural river function, restore natural flows, or?
I think the way that because it lists structures, the way that we'd originally sent it, I don't think it would have covered that. I think this does.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I chose the word structures, because it talks about dams, but also pretty much everything else that would impede the natural river flow.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. And so what Ben brings up is something that, as Catherine and I were walking through this, we try to reduce the repetitiveness and make statements that were, really straightforward and group them. And that's one of the reasons why we used the process that we did, so that we could see where the natural groupings were and the natural themes were. And so that's where really a lot of the pathway language came from.
It was really impressive how all the task group work kind of fit together in a real clear path forward. So it was great what everybody sent us.
And not to mention that, our charge is pretty clear, or what the law says it wants from us is pretty clear. So, just coalescing our ideas around that was a challenge. Any other thoughts or suggestions around pathway language? Chris and team also did some editing on the pathway language that we originally sent out. So thank you guys for that, because it really made it, we really want it to be, when somebody's reading it in the climate action plan, or when we were presenting it to the council, that it's really clear what we're saying.
Yeah. Hey,
Erica, along similar lines then, as sort of proof of concept, can we also look at, and we can't scroll on your screen, so that's part of why I'm asking, can we look at where locating new development outside of hazardous areas lives and where resilient design and construction standards live?
Wait for it.
It's under 4.
Right. Yep. So develop private and public funding sources to flood-proof and elevate commercial and residential properties, as well as retain and restore ecosystem services upstream to protect people. And there we go. Modernize planning and development statutes and regulations to incorporate foreseeable climate change impacts, adaptation and resilience consideration, including the development of resilient design and construction standards.
Okay, yep.
And it's also under the update state and local land use governance. If you
Right.
Where it says limiting development in hazard areas.
Yep, and reducing fragmentation of intact forest blocks, working forest and habitat connectivity areas. That was something that, again, felt strongly about, and that falls within the jurisdiction of municipal control.
Good, thank you.
And then the construction standards is the, let's see, 1, 2, we should have lettered these, Erica, 1, 2,
You can do that.
3, 4. The 5th
Sorry.
bullet under number 4 mentions the development of resilient design and construction standards.
I can letter these. We're gonna want to do that.
Eric, can you slide down to scroll down to 5, the new one there? So
Yep.
thank you. Just want to. I guess in this one, and I think it goes in the top, but in 5 there, do we want to ensure that people also have access to, and maybe you pick this up in services, but energy or electricity, right? And I'm thinking about sort of microgrids and islanded sources of energy, renewables paired with storage and controls for load management.
Do you feel like that's a housing one, or is that more of a like municipal design?
Yeah, it could be
like grid design.
Yeah, and I think we have it up in two, the last bullet of two, I think it was, but Mike, and I'll ask you as well. Do you feel that this picks up, things like what GMP is doing in Panton? When I talk with Liz Miller and other folks at GMP, there's this big push to create these they're kind of like the resiliency zone, but
Yeah, when Ben asked the question, I quickly was zoomed back up to 2 because I felt like and Chad and I did have that in there, but I think expand.
Most of what you folks had provided is underneath 2,
right.
under infrastructure.
And if our editing, we lost some of the important nuance that needs to be in there to get those concepts across, we should make some corrections.
Yeah.
But to answer Erica's question, I think it's both individual housing resiliency as well as at a town or municipal scale.
I mean, and we grouped it under infrastructure because that's where some of the overlap is, but really, in terms of the strategy is going to have COVID benefits across pathways. So it's not stovepiped, thankfully.
Yeah, I mean, I struggle with, there's overlaps between scale and policy. So that maybe just is what it is.
Yeah, and I think implement strategic upgrades to substation, distribution, transmission, certainly the stuff we're doing could fall under that, Chad.
Yeah. Okay. Mike, do you think we should call out like a low cost option could be the concept of an islanded circuit, right? Or microgrids, just to call it out. Because I think, those are terms of art that not everybody knows, but I think, people would understand.
Yeah, and the original language did call for storage, right?
Yeah, you got storage there, but I mean, you need control for a microgrid or an islanded circuit. You need controls, storage, and the generation resource, right?
Do you think that's the general public understands all that? I mean, it's an opportunity for you to explain that to them.
I've been looking at the main plan and trying to see what kind of language they put forth over there, under the same kind of thought, like it's got to be explainable and it's got to be understandable.
Also, I think it's important to add something about how our systems may need to change. So there's a bullet in there about upgrading existing transmission and existing infrastructure, and that may be the most resilient thing to do. But there may also be, to your point, there may be other ways of building resilient energy infrastructure, especially in rural communities that may rely more on distributed energy systems, microgrids, storage. And so I think it's important to signal to people that our systems may need to change. You might not get that, transformer upgrade or capacity upgrade in your community. You may need to start thinking about other types of energy infrastructure and energy supply. So it does seem worth calling it out more specifically.
Okay.
I think this does give an opportunity for folks to learn about what this means. I mean, these are concepts that are going to become more and more common over the next, several years. Just a quick follow-up: is this in the right spot, or is it not really important? It could be in any of the spots. Land use, housing, infrastructure. Okay.
When we talk about new construction of housing, I think that is an opportunity to have local individual resilience by adding in storage. So that's the only thing that makes me wonder if there should be a mention of that there as well.
And Anne, you wanted to jump in too?
Thanks. I think this is just a matter of some of the nuance of the way we had presented. We had 5 strategies and lumped under them. a bunch of recommendations, and now there's these higher order strategies, and what we had as strategies have now become, something lower order. But in our detail, in our nuance, we talk about that idea of exploring microgrids and controls and all of that. So in my opinion, it's captured by what's here, because this is exactly our higher order points from our recommendations. So I don't know if that means we just need to modify this to get some of the nuance in, or whether it's just the next iteration of this is going to have that nuance. But I think what we had here, these were our big bullet points that encompass that nuance about microgrids and controls. That's my point.
Right. And this, we were mentioning earlier, and that based on the framework that the council is looking to see from us, we really had to focus on some of those higher order, messages. But all of the work that you folks compiled is all centrally located now. And it's not lost, because it's going to be really necessary when the climate plan is being actually written, that all of that nuance is included in there. There's also a public engagement process that will come next, that will, where some of those actions, where they'll become actions, will come forward from the public. Will you be able to utilize that language? It'll also validate that those are the same actions that we in this subcommittee felt were necessary. I think we've done a lot of the pre-work, some of the drafting of the plan, hopefully, with all of the detail that everybody provided. I wanted to call folks' attention to number 2. So proactively and strategically. So this is the infrastructure one, unbuilt infrastructure, and we had some feedback that I think really originated from the language around critical infrastructure. And we threw around critical infrastructure a lot, and I don't know that we ever really landed on what is or isn't critical infrastructure, because there's a lot of differing opinions on that based on the context that you're applying the concept to. So so what I did was I redrafted this a little bit. I'm trying to, my little Zoom thing is over that. I just want to show the markup. Oh, whoops, sorry. So now instead of reading lifeline critical infrastructure, it actually just says proactively and strategically enhance resilience in transportation, communications, water, wastewater, and energy infrastructure statewide. It's really straightforward, doesn't get into needing to define what lifeline critical infrastructure is, as well as a concept that could become pretty controversial in meaning what is the definition of lifeline community infrastructure. Plus, our charge we don't have to define what critical infrastructure is or isn't, or the climate plan doesn't have to do any prioritization. The prioritization actually comes from some of the strategies that are being that are put forth, meaning create a framework for identifying and evaluating climate resilience threats, identify, prioritize, and protect vulnerable structures and critical infrastructure. So it's really about that's where the detail in terms of prioritization will come from. I chose to edit this to make this a bit less controversial and be very straightforward, so that it's based on built infrastructure. What do folks think about that?
Works for me.
Yeah, I'm fine with it.
Nobody's going to question what that is, where some might have questioned.
Right.
So.
Right. The other thing is, when we talk about critical infrastructure, we talk about like food systems and the ability for somebody to have access to shelter or, you know, certain safety net systems. You know, I think we're covering a lot of those in many of the other strategies and pathways that are in here. I think if we had a pathway that was around critical infrastructure, community infrastructure, it would have been unwieldy. So we had to kind of break it out.
I wanted to pass along a comment from, since it seems like everybody's okay with that, I wanted to pass along a comment from Karen Horn, who couldn't be here today, but she would love to see the first strategy expanded a bit to say, oh no, I'm sorry, it's not the first strategy, it's the next to the last one, seeking funding to implement the cost prohibitive projects that improve rural energy and communications resilience. She wanted to add at the end of that, including infrastructure to provide capacity for remote work and meetings. And her reasoning there is to ensure that municipalities have the capacity that they need to shift to remote as needed and be able to function well. Sorry about the construction work in the background while I was talking.
Can't really hear it.
Oh, good.
I mean, is that captured in communication resilience? I mean, I understand the clarification, but
I think she was passing that along based on a comment that she heard from a legislator, for what that's worth.
I wonder though, if that belongs in critical infrastructure or in infrastructure, or if it belongs more under 5. It's probably one of those either or things too. Being able to basically have adequate broadband access is what that equates to, right?
Yeah, more than resilience, right? Can you say
Yeah,
that
it's
once more,
not
Catherine?
not just broadband, but the actual technology that's needed to support all of that.
Okay.
So maybe it goes in one. I don't know.
Capacity building. Let's see.
We have a new governmental agency to help with that too. The Vermont
Right.
Community Broadband.
Oh, right.
And we don't need to change anything either. I'm passing along Karen's comment.
Well, I look at the last bullet underneath 1, support workforce development and trades and skills that are needed to implement climate resilience and emission reduction actions. Well, maybe that's
Yeah, that's not really it.
I see what the idea is, to be able to support a more decentralized workforce and decentralized government operations versus just trying to think about where that fits best. Okay.
There was a bunch of funding just made available for that very thing that the Vermont Community Broadband Authority is going to hand out. Because the bullet she was referring to does ask about funding. I think that funding has already been, it's already been gotten, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Do folks think that needs to be, the decentralized workforce needs to be called out specifically, or do you feel like that's going to be a byproduct of many of the strategies that are outlined here?
When you say decentralized workforce, you mean being able to, anybody being able to work from home?
Yeah, and being able to switch back and forth. I think that's the idea is being able to, you know, continue continuity of operations as a measure of resilience, but having the technology, the communications infrastructure to do so. I'm not getting the feeling that the group feels strongly about it.
No.
Well, we tripped up on this a little bit. I'm thinking of Ann, you and I talking about resilience of the community, the communication system. That's having battery backup and things like that because of the characteristics of fiber. But again, it didn't address getting broadband out there in the first place, right? It was more, how do we keep it going?
Right.
But I get her point. I mean, everyone needs broadband. Maybe we could just mention it and also say that this is also being addressed by the Vermont Community Broadband Authority or something like that.
And we're seeing conflicting opinions in the chat about whether it needs to be called out or not. So, Anne, are you raising your hand about this topic or, oh, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I wonder, I mean, if my group here, Chad and Mike, are amenable to it and others like it, we could just make a slight modification to that bullet and say, seek funding to implement cost prohibitive projects that improve rural energy and communications access and resilience. We could just add access right in there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's.
That seems so simple.
Yes. Thank you, Anne.
Okay.
Thumbs up.
Awesome. I mean, I think when we talked about broadband, maybe this is more, I think the question might come up from the council about where does broadband fit in all of this? And doesn't broadband, you know, factor into resilient community? And I think my answer to that, and let me know if I'm wrong, is that we talk a lot about communications infrastructure and the resilience of communications infrastructure, but don't narrow it into broadband specifically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's just that all the gadgets of the future are going to be electrified, and though they need to be controlled, right? Like you'll be able to control, you know, your yeah, we can already control our thermostats, right? But you'll be able to control like when your car charges on your phone, and it's all got to be, there's going to be massive amounts of data that need to be transmitted to control like our everyday lives when we electrify everything, not just transportation, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think that word access really covers it. It really does.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we start from the top and just kind of read through the strategies one more time as a group here. I'm not going to read them out loud, but just thinking about these and thinking about the global context of the act and our charge, and thinking about this in terms of clarity and completeness.
And I'll just throw out that I'm seeing folks from the public who are offering comments in the chat. Feel free to jump in. We keep a pretty informal committee here, so I am reading the comments and paying attention to them. But feel free to jump in as well. You don't have to reserve all your thoughts until the last 5 minutes of the meeting. So what are folks' thoughts about pathway 1 and the resulting strategies? Are there recommended changes you'd like to make at this point? Are you feeling pretty comfortable about where this is?
this is Ben. Yes, but just as Erica clarified the wording so that people would know what critical infrastructure meant, we may be begging the same fuzziness in
Right.
increased local and regional capacity, including community and civic infrastructure.
Should we say systems then?
Well, maybe I need to hear people give examples of what we're talking about. Maybe there's a more clear way of defining that category of thing. Sorry, I don't have a solution, but I feel like it's vague.
Ian, do you have a solution to offer?
I don't know if a solution, but I'll throw some rambling y'all's way and hope that it's helpful. It strikes me that what y'all are trying to get at here is that there is both kind of official capacity, right? Like from the state that needs to be improved and enhanced, but also an acknowledgement that particularly in rural communities, there are kind of non-official, volunteer-led initiatives and work that is done to provide people with resources. Rural folks tend to live in that kind of neighbor to neighbor space. So maybe this could be solved with some parentheses that say like including, local volunteer efforts, neighbors helping neighbors, something to that degree, to make sure that it's clear that they need both support from something like, say, an RPC, but also an acknowledgement that there are unofficial resources that need support and to be utilized as well, particularly in the rural context.
Ian, this has been, yes, I think that helps. But it also brings me back to thinking about something I had tried to say at an earlier meeting, which is that it is not necessarily government's job to increase, it's government's job to create conditions under which those things can thrive. And I think politically, it's wise to acknowledge that we're not the source of some of those things. We're simply a facilitator or enabler or cheerleader. The verb is increase. And I wonder if that's the right verb.
I think it is. Regardless of how it's increased, I think we need to see more of that, both formal and informal community infrastructure.
And I don't see any direct accountability to, the state in any of this language.
Okay.
I think we'll just have to hold that comment for the actions and make sure we don't put any in that say like the Vermont
yeah.
Emergency Management will be required to set up volunteer organizations in every town.
What?
Yeah.
You can't, I was distracted and my kid was distracting me.
Oh yeah, that's next. It's a priority.
Yeah, perfect timing.
I think it needs to say shall, Catherine, just for the record.
So did we land, do the parentheses help define, and I think it's actually community and civic systems or versus infrastructure, because infrastructure is kind of a loaded word.
Yeah.
I think networks is often used as well, talking about social networks,
Yeah.
community cohesion,
Yeah.
so that could also work.
I like that word. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. Okay. Ian, I just want to note you still have your hand up just in case that's a legacy hand. There you go. Okay. Okay, let's move down to 2. So this is the infrastructure one. I felt like the strategies under this one could be more organized. I wasn't able to organize them that way.
I mean, I think it's the nature of the different committees who are working on this never really met to kind of harmonize them. So I think there's different pieces for different subgroups. And
What we're also missing,
Mhm.
like in terms of a strategy, is related to water and wastewater infrastructure. So we may need to just call that out as a placeholder for that. Anne?
Thanks. Two things. One, I think our energy and communications ones are sort of decoupled from each other. I don't know if it would help to consolidate them. And the other is the very last bullet, implement strategic upgrades, et cetera. In the final version that Chad and Mike and I arrived at of our own sort of slide deck of these, that was just actually a sub bullet. So a more minor recommendation, I guess, or an example action under what we were under the one above, seek funding, et cetera. So it's taken a detail and elevated it up to whatever you're calling these bullets here, not pathways, strategies maybe.
Strategies.
So I don't feel super strongly about whether it needs to be removed. I don't know if Chad or Mike do. It just elevates something that we had sort of as subservient to a larger pathway.
That's my formatting mistake. That's all that is.
Thanks.
So what are your thoughts about that, Mike and Chad?
Can you go back up a little bit too, Erica?
Second?
Yes. I was just looking again, even though I've read this 100 times, if we had covered updates for resiliency and things like that. And I know in the detailed one, we have bullets like that.
Right. Yeah, I guess, I don't know. As long as that last bullet is called out in the next level of detail, I think it's okay to remove it here. But I think, in addition to seeking funding, like, we're still going to have to make these strategic upgrades to substations, whether the rate base has to pay for it or whether, we need to do this. So are we only going to seek funding? Are we only going to do it if we, are successful in seeking funding, or are we going to make those investments? I just want to make sure that is called out.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the level of consensus we were able to get to, was that the funding should be sought. Those things, depending on what they are, and they mean, different people have different opinions on what those required upgrades are and what the strategy is.
Yeah.
And I think as far as we were kind of all able to agree with our different hats on, at least seeking funding for those was in a level we were able to get to some comfort with each other on. So I guess if we're going to change that, probably that would require more discussion.
Sure.
Right. I am just trying to, I'm pulling up the all of the detail here, just a second. Where all the detail is. Okay.
Yeah, because remember, we had the established framework for valuing resiliency investments. So it did cover the resiliency investments in the finer detail.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess as long as we're.
Is there like because these have to be higher level, but they also, we don't want them to be so broad as to be confusing. Are there some such as statements that need to be added to some of these strategies that would make them a little bit more specific?
Yeah, we could do that with a little more time, I think. But if we have, I think if we had assurance that all of the detail that we worked out would end up in the next iteration, that would help.
Yeah.
Because there are ongoing investments taking place now. I mean, if you look at Joe's list of existing programs that are already out there.
Yeah, that's what I just want to make sure that we're not limiting these strategic upgrades to situations where we're able to secure funding. We are going to have to make these investments, and some of that's going to be made on behalf of private sector, right? Like when we build projects, we're paying for improvements to the grid in that location, the point of interconnection, and often making upgrades, reclosers, and things like that. And those are investments. I mean, they're not made by the state, they're made by the private sector, but those investments need to be made. Hopefully we can get funding for them, because that eliminates the tension between ratepayers paying and putting everything on the backs of industry, in which case when things get too expensive, deals don't work, they don't pencil financially, so they don't get built and nothing happens. So
Chad, would do for that bullet, if we simplified it to say implement cost prohibitive projects, or strategically implement cost prohibitive projects, rather than seeking funding.
Yeah, or just maybe we could add seek funding and make investments.
Or seek funding to go along with existing investments, or something like that.
Yeah, and I think with existing is okay, but we're gonna have to even make more, right? I think that's what we want to communicate. And again, it's private sector is going to get there. The cost of the technology continues to decrease. There's going to be attractive investment opportunities, but those investments need to be made by somebody other than a state or a federal funding source.
Hold on, we've got Ian and Bronwyn that have their hands up. Let's go with Ian first and then Bronwyn.
Thank you, Erica. A couple of thoughts, some of whom I threw in the chat. One was kind of per the earlier conversation about the importance of making sure that it is clear that the energy system may need to fundamentally change, and that when you all are talking about kind of upgrades and investments, you're not just talking about upgrading what is actually there, but also maybe investing in new and emerging technologies. I wonder if it makes sense to use that new and emerging technologies language somewhere in this section. I'm thinking potentially on that last bullet where folks added like microgrids, island circuits, and some of the more specific examples there.
That's a good point, Ian. I think we're still back and forth about whether we want to nix that bullet in terms of having it be an overarching strategy, and have it flow into the detail of the strategies and the actual plan.
I hear you. Yep.
And you had mentioned having some assurances that some of that work would make it into the plan, and I just don't have sufficient detail about the process of the plan building that is going to occur. When we talked about it, like with Jane and Marion, we've talked about being able to utilize a lot of that work in the development of the plan. I just don't know that I can give you an assurance that word for word, every single piece of your work is going to go into the plan, given the public engagement process that's going to also happen.
Yeah, no, and I don't guess insurance was the wrong word. It was more like in the next level of detail that we provide. I assume that there's going to be a process to create some more detail around all of this.
Yeah.
And anything that's not eliminated, by the Climate Council is a higher order strategy. And we've already done that work, it feels like, in our task group. And so we have it ready to go. And, we've had a lot of those conversations already. So I guess it's just in the next iteration of our work, depending on what comes back from the Climate Council, is that where those details go in. And, you know, I think we had tried to structure everything around our own set of pathways and recommendations. So every word kind of mattered there. And then when these, I think just like, so we had taken what I think was maybe 10 recommendations and condensed them into 5 pathways. And I wonder if, since you've pulled our headers basically from the 5 slides, we need to go back and just pull what were our 10 recommendations and have more. So these 5 become 10 essentially. And then some of the more important concepts that we tried to consolidate and the detail got lost now can come back out. So we talked about those 2 or 3 meetings ago, so I can pop them back in the chat if it's helpful, or just the ones that are not here already.
I don't think we have space to add 10.
The 5 more from this. So it's, I think we shrunk down from 10 to the 5 that are here.
Yeah.
And that, I think without having the detail, that's why we're having these questions now about like, oh, my point about microgrids is now no longer there, or the detail about who funds what is no longer there. It's just an idea that to try to assuage some people's concerns that now their important point is lost.
Oh, I see. So you're just sharing those, not suggesting that we add 5 more back in to these strategies.
Well, I guess, sorry, I'm not explaining well. In the work that we tried to do to turn our 10 recommendations into 5 pathways, you know, you've pulled those 5 now, but I think we didn't, without realizing that the detail was going to go away of underneath each of those, it might make sense to revert back to our 10 in total recommendations to be, you know, so it adds 5 more to what's here. We have 5. Our 5 are the first bullet, the 3rd bullet, and I guess the last 4 bullets, but that last one is the 6th one. So there's only 4 more to add to get to our total 10. I don't know, it's a lot to think about.
You folks didn't put those forward because you kind of had to prioritize them, but what you're suggesting is putting them back in, because when I took the headers from your slides that you had itemized as pathways, and so you're saying that you would have 4 more to add to that.
4 more. The ones we presented a total of 10 high order recommendations when we presented 2 weeks ago or 2 meetings ago, I think. Not on the 16th, but the meeting before that, maybe the 2nd. We had presented our original 10, and then we said, oh, well, the assignment now is to fill out this template, you know, with our own strategies and pathways. So that's where we went from 10 to 5. So, but since those aren't being used in the way we sent them, we might just revert back to the 10 that we presented on the 2nd.
I don't know that we have space to add 4 more strategies
Okay.
in what we're asked to present to the Climate Council.
Okay, maybe then we need to just modify these a little bit. Like you said, do some wordsmithing to make sure those important points aren't lost.
Right.
I
Okay,
have
so
a
we
thought
have,
on this.
go ahead, Mike, and then we're going to get to Bronwyn and then Jane.
You know, just reading again the actual pathway, it talks about strategically enhancing critical infrastructure. And I wonder if just adding the word strategically investing to enhance critical infrastructure, just so it's not lost that, I mean, nobody thinks that any of this is going to be for free, right?
Yeah.
It sure would be easier if it was, though.
Yes. I'm wondering if that would just cover it, and it takes out where any of the dollars come from, and it's strategic and proactive, and because that's really the only place I find where it in number 2, where it could point out the fact that investments are going to need to be made in order to create resiliency.
So I want to point out something that Hatfield just put in the chat around, and if everybody could just take a look at that, just basically to summarize, this isn't our last shot at this. So in terms of, if we can land on what the big ideas are that in terms of strategies that we want the Climate Council to see coming from us, and then we can further refine and tweak the actual strategy language to make sure that it's not cutting out and it's got the appropriate level of detail in it to capture the work of your task group and anybody else's task group. Does that sound good to folks? That if we can just take a look at the language here, I can probably take tweaks to the existing language like over the weekend, as long as it's an easy cut and paste into the presentation. Happy to do that for sure, because this is again us presenting your work, and we don't want it to be wrong. We want it to reflect the work that you so diligently did.
And it looks like you got some thumbs up on the Mike's suggestion to just add the invest language in that pathway.
Yep.
Okay, so let's flag this.
Anne, are you okay with that?
Yeah, that sounds great. Thank you.
Yep. Sounds good.
Proactively and strategically invest and enhance resilience.
Yep.
Or invest to enhance?
Invest, yeah, to enhance. Yeah, that's it. Yep.
Okie dokie. And then Anne and Chad and Mike, like I said, if you want to, we're going to send this out after this meeting. If you want to take the number 2 and like reword some of the strategies that were related to your work, by all means do that. I can take it up until like Sunday evening, and then do a quick copy and paste in the morning.
Erica, it might have been just a typo, but it's invest versus invent.
Yeah, let's not invent.
Thanks.
I do strategic invention all the time.
Okay, Bronwyn, we've been waiting so patiently.
I'll still say something, but I'm a little hesitant now because I think clearly there's going to be a little bit of work on this one to package up some of these strategies. Maybe just a high level observation, especially as, fresh eyes to what's going on in the state. It does seem like it's worth trying to keep this at a higher level and figure out, well, where are we not being strategic? What needs to happen to be strategic about these investments? So it seems that, in this pathway, we're talking about transportation, wastewater, infrastructure, communication infrastructure, and energy infrastructure. And there's a couple of places where it calls out, hey, we need a framework for evaluating vulnerable energy infrastructure. We need a framework for communications as well. It seems like maybe transportation has already done some work in that, but it seems like the strategic part needs to be about pulling these together to be comprehensive as a package. Having energy and communications have an evaluation framework alone is not comprehensive. It needs to include so I just to point out that maybe the framework needs to be about taking what's been done with transportation and integrating it with whatever is going to be done for energy and communications. And I think if that kind of is pulled together, then it'll be easier to talk about, then we're going to use that to make some strategic investments. We're going to use that framework to integrate the work that we're doing. So I just wanted to pull out that it seems like we're talking about building frameworks for some of these, but not others. And it just seems to need to be part of the strategy to pull those vulnerability assessments together in some way.
Okay. I had a similar thought when I was looking at specifically creating a framework for identifying and evaluating climate resilience threats, and then identifying, prioritizing, and protecting, just evaluating climate resilience threats and impacts, and thinking maybe we should include the other 2 sectors there to make that a more holistic strategy. What do folks think about that?
it works for me. It's just everybody on our team, our gig is communications and energy, right?
Yeah.
Well, you did
Yeah.
such great work. We want to steal it for all the rest of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and so that means that there's, you know, more that in terms of actions that would be necessary to incorporate the transportation and you're right, like likely some of these assessments have already been done specific to the context of climate change, and we may just need to bring it together.
Yeah, and the vulnerability index that we did that was meant to take in everything, not just communications and energy, but economic, environmental, everything.
It may be more than we can do now, but I mean, it seems like if they're rolled together, it could shorten this to combine a lot of these.
Well, let's this is all really good conversation about how to tweak these, and I think we have some fertile ground to really refine them. So I think they at least communicate the large scale items that need to occur. Okay, so Jane, and then Ben and Ian, and then we gotta move on to the next one, because now we're cutting into
Getting crunch for time.
Go ahead, Jane.
I can be quick. I raised my hand after Pat dropped the clarifying points in the chat, and I thought I would just further illuminate or clarify some points. But I do, you know, there are contextual slides that I think you are all familiar with that I will present at the beginning that will ultimately get included with all of the slides for each of the sectoral presentations after the meeting on Monday, so that when someone from the public wants to click online and see what rural resilience was up to, you'll have these opening slides that I will present that will be included with your package. And like Pat said, they'll really stress that at this point, this is intended to be consensus around your pathways. And therefore, in order to demonstrate what those look like, it's intended to cherry pick the strategies from the different task leads that they've been working on that illuminate and try to bring clarity around what the full body of work will ultimately be under each pathway. But in no way is it supposed to be inclusive of all of the strategies. And then it's not supposed to go at all into action. Although some of the subcommittees will do that a bit, I think, because it's just impossible not to. But I just thought that would be helpful. And so really wordsmithing and focusing on the pathways feels really important to me right now. And then making sure that the right strategies are highlighted to create an understanding of what you're trying to build a body of work around for that pathway.
Thanks, appreciate that, Jane. Not the last bite at the apple. That's good. Ben.
Oh, thank you. Looking at 2, I think we all recognize that it's a little bit unwieldy still. And maybe it's because there are so many bullet points, and I keep reading the 3rd bullet and being unclear what it's actually trying to say. And I wonder if it's sort of a meta point that we've been talking about as we refined the 1st bullet. Or maybe there's something else that we're driving at there, but I need help with this 3rd one: integrate planning and preparedness across disciplines and geographies.
Maybe helpful is, so this is where when Anne was talking about context, it's missing some of the context that they had provided in the detail below these higher level, what were originally pathways. So I'm just going to pull that up, Anne, and Mike and Chad, if you wanted to talk about that.
I can, the detail in our slide talked about both planning and then sort of preparedness, but also implementation of various of these solutions that we've been talking about. So for instance, you need, roads to be able to access an area where you've experienced power failure or tree down, for instance. You need to have communications networks that are, your first responders are able to communicate with, whether it's the electric utility or whether, it's the fire department or the police, they need to be able to use the communications network, obviously, to contact, each other across the state. And so this has to do with like broad level planning, both at a state and a local level. So for instance, we're going to actually be really working with Vermont Emergency Management on their next statewide hazard mitigation plan, because we haven't really talked about energy and sort of energy, the planning that we think about in detail in the comprehensive energy plan in the context of the state's emergency management planning work, and vice versa. So we need that interdisciplinary planning work. And then also when it comes down to the actual preparing, actually having people meet on a regular basis in different geographies to sort of do an exercise. Hey, we have another Irene type situation, but it's another part of the state, different utilities, doesn't involve the utilities and players that were involved in that before. So it involves both the planning and then the actual execution of preparedness exercises. So you're able to, when the actual event unfortunately arises, step seamlessly into various roles and know who each other are and how to react. And it just also recognized the interdependency of all of those different sectors. We had a little quote here in one of our slides about the water energy nexus, for instance. Water is one of the areas where we're experiencing a lot of increase from flooding and these one-off storm events. So water is used in hydroelectric plants, right? We need it for energy generation. Maybe you have a hydro plant as the foundation of your microgrid, but the hydro plant is overwhelmed because you haven't done sort of the storm hardening or extra mitigation to prepare for those increased water events. So you need it for your energy, but you also it's a liability when it comes to safety, for example, and energy supplies. So that kind of interdisciplinary thinking is what we had in mind here.
And I can give a micro example where in 2 of our communities, we have had projects to improve the electrical distribution system, resulting in new power poles being put right in the middle of sidewalks. So that's an example where some advanced planning would prevent one improvement from interfering with another. I think we do. Unless there's anybody that really needs to jump in on 2, I think we really do need to move on and make sure we hit the others. It's 20 after 2.
Okay. Ian, do you have one last comment?
Yeah, I'll try to make it quick. And I know it's on a bullet that you guys may not even keep, but just around the last bullet on 2 with the language around kind of low cost options, I wanted to just raise a concern that I had around that, given that in the absence of any form of carbon pricing or way of accounting for the harmful economic impacts of fossil fuels and high emitting sectors, any kind of cost to cost comparison between a clean energy technology and say a fossil fuel technology is not quite on a level playing field. And so I just wanted to raise that there may be a need for some other kind of filter, especially because with clean energy investments generally, they usually have a high upfront cost, but then savings over time, and how those savings appear depends on how far out you look in terms of the cost effectiveness there.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Let's move on to number 3, which is related to reduction of fossil fuel use in rural areas through equitable best practices. First, take a look at that, take a look at the strategies that are underneath that, and then come back to the pathway and think about whether it's communicating what it needs to.
And in this one, we recognize that there's going to be more work that needs to be done after the cross-sector mitigation group has really refined their work, and we're going to take that and develop some more best practices. But we thought it was really a great opportunity for public feedback on this pathway to make sure we put it in here.
Rowan and Ben, you both still have hands up. I just want to make sure that you don't have anything you need to say. Okay, all right, thanks.
And I see Anne's point about municipal audits, and I was wondering as we looked at this, if we might, we did add language about prioritizing ARPA funds, but I wondered if we might word that to say work to implement and fund audit recommendations. So a little further up. No, you can, it just, it's an inserting and fund. So second line, implement, second line of the first bullet, implement and fund audit recommendations. And the point about prioritizing ARPA funds was put in there at Karen's suggestion at the need to want to push this, elevate this in priority, because there is so much pent up work ready to go. If only there was money.
Okay. I don't hear anything burning.
I got one thing, sorry.
Okay.
I meant to put my hand up, but thanks, Erica. I guess I'm just wondering, are we covering, replacement fuels here? That could be electricity, like EV charging networks. It could be, other things. Or is that, you kind of like utilize local energy plans with clear goals and strategy to prioritize efforts, including infrastructure. It's kind of like, okay, well, we're going to reduce fossil fuel, but what are we going to replace it with? And how are we going to replace that energy, that hole in our energy supply as we
Geothermal.
Right.
So should we say reduce or replace?
Yeah, it's kind of like we've got to replace too. And there's got to be more,
reduce,
right?
and replace.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other items for this one? Okay, we're going to 4. This is a big one. So I'll wait a few minutes and then I'll come back down through. Ian, are you talking about for that first bullet of this one, or?
I was thinking kind of right after 4 in that kind of ensure Vermont's land use policies paragraph.
Okay, the pathway itself.
So maybe something along the lines of like by promoting compact development, inserting smart growth in that kind of item of commas potentially, if it makes sense.
By promoting compact development and smart growth.
Yeah.
E.g. smart growth.
I wonder though.
Interchangeable, but
Yeah, because when you look on it 5, I guess we don't say smart growth, or and that probably is a word that brings a lot of context to it to different people. But Chris, I'll defer to you on where that more appropriately fits, whether it's in land use or something.
Some people get it, some people are angered by it. So I just tried to choose some more neutral words.
I think, maybe it doesn't, maybe we leave it like that, and then we can reference it later on in the strategies.
The thing that jumps out to me here is we talk a lot about compact development, more urban, and I think about the fact it doesn't change what's already out there, right? And some of the strategies that we have to do to get broadband, to get more resilient service to these rural communities, I hate to say it, but may actually promote more building in rural areas. But you also can't not give the rural communities the resilience they need either. So I just thought there was a bit of a there, that's all. And I don't know if we should acknowledge that we also have to make really rural areas more resilient as well, and not just try to bring in more dense and get people into urban areas. Just a thought.
Right. So trying to think of how that translates in terms of land use.
I guess if we're only talking about the future, it doesn't, right?
We've got the built environment we have. I think this is just looking forward about, when new development occurs, where should we try to steer it, to be more resilient and sustainable.
I think we address the enhancement of local resilience, but more in the planning and preparedness realm versus the investment in existing infrastructure in the first bullet. I guess we look at investment of existing infrastructure in the infrastructure bullet or pathway. Okay, so coming back to the actual language of the pathway, is it clear, concise, does it reflect what we're trying to communicate?
I have, I think the chart or the overall, number 4 seems pretty good. I'd welcome, others' thoughts there. I was gonna go down to one of the one of the bullets, the third bullet. Update state and local land use governance regulations, practices, and investments to eliminate barriers to housing development and compact. I don't know if we want to open that up at all, like to include, okay, if we're gonna encourage that kind of development, we also need to supply it with electricity or energy. And so do we want to include that there as well? Do we want to talk about streamlining regulations regarding to not just housing development in compact areas, but also energy development in those areas?
If we just take out the word housing, I think that now that we have a separate housing pathway,
Yeah.
I think taking out housing here could make a lot of sense.
Okay.
If we decide to go with the housing pathway, but it seemed like there was good consensus around that earlier.
Yeah, if you take out housing, then
Right. Yeah,
it includes the infrastructure to feed that new housing. So
yeah, and it also includes larger things, like I don't know, grocery stores and other like critical community infrastructure that's not residential.
Right. And I think in the chat here, Tamara was making some pretty valid comments. I think that we are talking about a pretty major shift in Vermont's land use regulations. If this is implemented, the language is there now in the statute, in terms of goals, but the actual implementing statutory language is not as strong as some of our strategies might suggest.
On this bullet that I have highlighted, Chris, do you think that is more appropriate now that we have a housing pathway? Or do you think this is more pertaining to land use?
Well, I think you can just take it out completely. I think it's more of an action, and it fits under the other ones. So
Okay,
I mean, it'll come up
and-
later, but it's not a high
Yeah.
level. This is more detailed.
right. Is there any heartburn about that, folks?
Nope.
Done.
A little bit, we were just struggling to figure out how to talk about housing under this rubric.
Right.
And
Yeah.
until we made another separate housing, so that makes it work better.
Okay. Great. Tamara has also has a proposed wording change instead of ensure Vermont's land use policies to change Vermont's land use policies. What do folks think about that?
Yeah, sounds good.
It's pretty easy to do.
I think. Okay.
So change to be adaptive instead of ensure that they are adaptive.
Right. So change land use. Yes. Land use policy. To be right. Okay. Okay.
So might need a little bit more words, but with that change, it just sounds, it sounds to me that you're changing the policy so that the policies are adaptive as climate change happens, rather than the land use planning is adaptive. So it might just need a little bit more wordsmithing to make it really clear that we're changing the land use policies on land development so that the land development is adaptive and resilient and not the policies themselves, although maybe they should be as well, but it's a lot harder to change those, so.
That's a good comment, Bronwyn. So change Vermont's land use policies so that current and future land use will be, right?
I read that as that's more the intent that I think we were going for. It's
Yeah,
a
that makes
very,
sense.
it's a nuance, but might be worth getting it right.
How's that sound?
Friendly amendment, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, can we move on to 5?
So I'm the one comment I have about 5 echoes what I think Mike brought up earlier, which is that the language, I think, doesn't completely address the reality that there will continue to be development in rural areas. And it's not all going to be in compact mixed use developments. It's just not, that's not a realistic vision of Vermont's future. So I think the language somehow needs, I don't know how to massage it, so I haven't had time to think about it enough, but I think some of this language needs to be massaged enough to address that.
Oh, I wonder if it's an expansion of opportunity versus ensuring all people in Vermont have. Again, a nuance, but it's, it may be worded this way for specific reasons. So I want to make sure that Chris and Bronwyn have the opportunity to talk about that.
Yeah, but broadband and things like that are trying to get to every single Vermonter, right? To ensure that they all have equitable access.
And it just says access. It doesn't,
I'm coming at you as the rural representative on the Climate Council to just note that the culmination of 4 and 5 together suggests an end of the rural way of life is a comment that I think will be heard as a result of these two combined together. And so somehow in here, and I don't know where, and maybe if the committee could trust us to do so, we could add some language that notes the need for the working landscape and acknowledges the rural existence in addition to all of these things we're trying to do for future development.
I support that. I want to
I
word
do as
something
well.
now. Now.
It feels almost like the same conversation as you'll talk about right sizing infrastructure, right? And this feels like a similar conversation. It's about putting in the right kind of infrastructure, that ensures that anybody who's working on a farm and providing all of us our food still has resiliency, but maybe it means that it's not because it's connected to the grid, it's because they have their own solar and storage, right? So to me, it
Yeah,
feels
and
like a
it's not
conversation
because,
about-
right. Yeah, and it's not because the state's gonna spend $500,000 to upgrade the road to the 3 houses if you choose to live there. Like there's trade-offs to it in terms of prioritizing investment and the reality of that, but just need to think about how to word it.
Yeah, if there's a different, I don't know if there is a word yet for like right sizing, but for like appropriate technology for, that reality.
So do you want to work on this with us, Catherine, or does that make sense given we're running out of time, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
if the committee's comfortable with that. Without changing the overall intent of the pathway and strategies. And recognizing that we have to have this ready by Monday morning.
We can take changes until Sunday night.
Monday night. And I don't know how people feel about it, but the part about assisting private property owners to rehabilitate existing underutilized buildings and the investments, none of these get to the safe housing. And I think that there's a missing piece about inspections. And I know the governor vetoed the statewide inspection bill, but I think we need to have a strategy that somehow incorporates the word of inspection somehow. That's my opinion. I'm curious others.
Do you want to flag that, Catherine, or do you want that to be something that is a message that's conveyed on Monday?
I think it needs to somehow be in what we present on Monday.
Okay.
I mean, it's part of the governance and regulations and practices too, but you could put a finer point on it. But that's only for compact centers, so. Yeah. Fair point. Touche myself.
Okay, so you guys are going to work on this a little bit more, but the overall theme is going to remain with those amendments. Okay. Any other items that need to be addressed on number 5?
This is Ben, just very quickly. We don't need to get into it now, but for a future discussion, I just want to flag that we have to think about whether there's a distinction between pre-existing scattered development and future scattered development. Does the state want to continue to take on the obligation of providing all the infrastructure to continued fragmentation for residential development? Or does the state want to say, going forward, if you build a 1/4 mile driveway, you really are on your own?
Yeah.
I'm on my own here.
Yep.
So.
Yeah, I don't think states or towns usually take on anything like that right now, do they?
Oh, some do. I mean,
Some do?
there's like
Okay.
there's the one-offs that, the 1/2 mile town road that's really a driveway. all over the place.
I deal with those sad stories every week. There are people who didn't know when they bought their property or when they inherited it that they were going to be dealing with the washout that happened in November 2019, and now they're in crisis. And it's tough for the state to say, we just don't have any program for that. Good luck. But that's essentially what we say. And
Okay, we have Ian's comment, and then we do need to move on in our agenda.
Thank you all. I just wanted to emphasize the importance of the words working lands showing up somewhere here. I don't see them unless I'm missing them somewhere. And given the degree to which, I mean, so much of Vermont's rural landscape is in private hands, and the land use, gosh, I'm forgetting what the name of the policy is right now, that you get money for working your lands. Doesn't include
Current use.
Current use.
Thank you guys. It's embarrassing to be an FC person to not have current use in. But I don't know if it makes sense to call out the current use program specifically, or as at this strategy level. But I do know there's been an ongoing conversation around making sure that current use can incorporate conservation as well. So there's an option other than conservation easements for conservation.
Yeah, I think that Ag and Ecosystems Group has a strategy related to that. I remember vaguely seeing something related to that.
Great. Then I'll also just say, as someone who has rented in Vermont on relatively low income, +1 on the safety and affordability pieces, that's huge. And to the degree that the Climate Council can be a venue for improving the safety and accessibility of housing in Vermont, so much the better.
Ian, I'm pretty sure natural resources and working lands are considered in the fourth pathway.
Fair enough. Appreciate that.
Okay. We've gotten to the point. So just a couple of action items. Sounds like Mike and Chad and Ann may have some tweaking to do to the language around infrastructure in the pathways. So I'll be keeping an eye on my email for that. And then Catherine and Chris and Bronwyn are going to be doing a little bit of tweaking on 5. But overall, we're there, and we'll just be copying and pasting into our presentations, which are pretty much largely done except for copy and pasting. So.
And you need these by what, Tuesday? Is that what you said?
No. Sunday.
Great work, everybody. Yay.
Yay. Pretty excited about this. Great. And it will be definitely a point of pride to represent this committee's work on Monday for sure. So let's talk about next steps in August and September. I have the milestones. Do you want me to share the milestones, Jane, or from May?
They're significantly updated, and that'll be shared with the council meeting on Monday, just because, lots of moving pieces. Happy to preview them now. Actually, while you guys are all talking, I'm working on my presentation too behind the scenes, so have it open. But maybe what I'll share with you, actually, to keep it brief and not take too much time, mindful of, here we go. Down here, hold on. One of the slides that I'll share on Monday talks about next steps for the subcommittees. So, this is a really amazing milestone. I do just feel like everybody should feel really proud of the collective work of the subcommittees and council to the moment. But, July 26th is sort of a launching point for the next components of work. And we'll speak specifically about public engagement also on Monday at the council. But thinking about subcommittee tasks specifically, the idea will be that Marion and I will take the feedback. CBI will, as they always do, will take minutes for the meeting on Monday, and I'll make sure all subcommittee members can sit back and relax, so to speak, at the meeting, because CBI staff will take detailed minutes around the issues and ideas that they're hearing from council members. Again, not with the intent of detailed comments on your strategies at this point, but really just we're going to frame it up with the idea of identifying any large gaps that subcommittees might have missed, thinking about where there's cross-cutting issues that could be elevated, and how to consider doing that across subcommittees to the benefit of the plan writing. And then also try to see and identify where ideas that are percolating up might be in conflict perhaps of each other. And so then Marianne and I, during that first week of August, will present those initial feedbacks to subcommittees and also suggest the process for how we're going to move forward at that time, as well as for ag and ecosystems and rural resilience in particular, we have a robust stakeholder engagement component already identified for cross-sector, but we haven't done that work with all of you yet, which is one component of the engagement. And so we'll want to spend some time with you all thinking about key stakeholders that you'll want to do engagement with to test and your more detailed components of your work rather than the broad engagement that we'll do with our consultants. And so that'll be important for you all to be thinking about, as well as thinking about as we transition into drafting both actions as well as the climate action plan. It'll be really good to have a narrative vision for your work, and how we do that, I think for all of you will require some thought about if there's capacity to think about a goal, or preferably a quantifiable goal, although I will admit, like, I have a much easier time thinking about that for ag and ecosystems than I do for a resilient landscape. So, but we can help facilitate a conversation around that and think about if you can get to a measurable, quantifiable vision, or if it's just a qualitative vision that would help inform how we would draft the opening components of that part of the climate action plan. And then, yes, we'll have to move into clear action development and implementation and start to tease out what's ready to go for this climate action plan. And you'll remember that we have it bucketed in immediate implementation and then work for further refinement. And so we'll start to tease that out and move into those components of the writing. So this is what we'll talk about on Monday. And then we'll also go into a little bit more detail about the public engagement plan and the milestones as far as meetings. But as you all probably, I think, know, the council will start meeting. Where did I stop share? The council will start meeting in September on a bi-weekly basis. And there'll be a big shift to action at a council level because ultimately they need to approve, like thinking about what that process looks like for approving the work out of the subcommittees and how we put it all together. So we'll start meeting a lot, even a lot more than we do already.
So Erica and I will need to coordinate closely with you and Marion because both of us are planning significant time off in August. And so this is the first time seeing if there's additional work we need to do in August. So we'll need to coordinate that closely with you.
That sounds great. I firmly believe in time off, so.
Me too. Great, thank you, Jane. Are there any questions for Jane on some of the next steps? We don't have scheduled meetings right now after this, so we do need to, like, next week. We have them on our calendars, but we don't have. We haven't identified what we need to cover at those meetings. So early next week we'll get some information out about what the schedule should look like, and specifically around this identification of stakeholders that we want to engage with and what that looks like. I think that's definitely a discussion point for us in the next couple weeks.
So hold the Fridays, but we'll send out some more details with specific dates.
Great. The next thing on the agenda was to go over preparatory actions for the Monday meeting, but I think we've generally covered that. And I'm just about to send out the updated document to everybody to your emails so that you have that to work from. Are there any other items? Is there any, like, if for those that can't be at the Climate Council meeting on Monday, are there any other messages you want us to convey to the council? Yes, so
let's get
Ian
this
was
done.
asking about, Ian was asking about publicly posting the updated document. We've got some the changes are tracked in it. I don't know, Jane, if that's something that can be, I'm sending it to the same listserv you're on. Okay, thanks. Okay, we've had public comment throughout the whole meeting. Is there any additional public comment that folks would like to input? Ian?
Just thank you. This is a lot, and it's come a long way, and it's been really incredible to watch you all wrestle with this bear of all of this work. So gratitude from someone on the outside for all of the good thinking and work that's going into this.
Thanks, Ian.
And thanks for your feedback along the way.
Okay, any final comments, Catherine?
Just thanks. It's great. A lot of hard work and we appreciate it.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, everybody. Okay.
Erica, do you want to stay on a second so we can coordinate getting the presentation done? Bye, everybody. Thank you.
I think the recording needs to stop.
Yeah, Jake, you could stop recording.